But first I'd like to remind you what happened on Thursday, because maybe you already forgotten. So the first session, I think, showed important. First session of the first part, I think, showed the importance of the Klaipėda Memel question both in British, French, and German politics. I think it added considerably to what Brendan has raised in his opening keynote, namely the role of the Klaipėda in the politics of the major European powers. Perhaps in this session we have somewhat neglected the Soviet-Russian factor, which was not present at all, and which was both in 1922 to 1923 and later, after, for instance, 1933, when, as we heard today in Ruth's presentation, the Memel merchants managed to resume the export of timber from the Soviet Union to the port of Klaipėda. However, these exports were no longer carried out through the Nemunas River as before the First World War, but mainly using the rail network. I think that showed us very well how important economic factors are for the development of regions like Klaipėda, Gdansk, and Gdynia, of course, which were also affected. So Klaipėda became part of Lithuania in 1923, but until a direct railway line was built through Lithuanian territory to Klaipėda, this took place only in 1932, Lithuania exported via the ports of Königsberg and Liepāja. So it had the port of Klaipėda, but it didn't use it. So I think that Poland also faced a similar problem to a certain extent, because the construction and development of Gdynia took time, of course. And I also think it is very important that we saw the role of economic actors, especially in the presentation of Klaus and Richter, in influencing political decisions. So it was, I think, very, highlighted particularly well in the presentation of Richter, Shindo. And the third session on Thursday showed us the mood and political demands created by the annexation of Klaipėda in Poland and in Estonia to a certain extent. So it is probably fair to say that Poland also benefited from the annexation of Klaipėda to Lithuania, as the Allies recognized Poland's eastern border and Vilnius as part of Poland. So this was not only, so to say, the good thing to Lithuania, but to Poland as well. Now, from all this we have learned that although the Klaipėda question seemed to have been settled in 1923, it continued to play an important role, especially in German-Lithuanian relations, and that basically means also in the relations between the principal Allied powers and Germany as well. And to sum all this up, I would like to recall a question we raised in the call for papers, which were sent to you before the conference, namely, to what extent did the legalization of 1923 take over within the framework of Versailles system contribute to the stability of the region? Or conversely, did the annexation of Klaipėda to Lithuania perhaps reinforce the image of the peripheral states, or the riparian state, how they were called, as hotbeds of instability, both in the face of the frozen conflicts over Vilnius and Danzig, and in the face of the reluctance of interwar Germany and Soviet Union to accept the territorial changes brought about by the Versailles system? Now, I think that the today's conference, of the conference today, has shown us very well how multicultural regions or border areas actually become these micro regions. We have this in our title, but what makes a region micro region? So this was shown, I think, particularly well today in some of the presentations, and how absorbed in the long run into the national imaginations, in some cases more successfully, in some cases less successfully, who benefits from these changes and who finds these changes particularly painful. Of course, there were some who were not very happy about what happened. Yeah, I will say something about it's actually and the mood of the inhabitants of the Klaipėda region towards the end of today's sessions. So after the First World War, both local politicians and representatives of the principal Allied powers, they actually considered a plebiscite in this region, in Klaipėda region, several times. But each time the idea was simply dropped because the result was predictable. So the Allies were afraid that the inhabitants, many of whom wanted to remain part of Germany, could not approve the idea behind the separation of the region from Germany because of its Lithuanian character. So that was actually the main argument during the Paris Peace Conference, that this region has some Lithuanian character, so why not separate it from Germany? And Lithuania Lithuania was afraid of the results of plebiscite, while it could not accept that the plebiscite could produce something that was that was completely contrary to Lithuania propaganda and imagination. So if the residents would vote that they would like to remain in Germany or part of Germany, so who would benefit from such a plebiscite? And yeah, the results of the 1925 census. So in 1925 there was a census in this region. The results of this census also showed, I think, how unpredictable these results of the eventual plebiscite could be. For the first time, the residents of the region were asked what their nationality was, and 44% of the region said that they were Germans, 26% of the region population said that they were Lithuanians, and 24% said that they were Memelanders. What nationality is Memelanders? So it's a useful question in terms of tuteiši and other so-called identities. Yeah, this is what I wanted to say at the beginning to sum up something what was happening on Thursday and today. And I would like to open the floor now for discussion. I think some of you have to say something. So just who wants to be first, Brandon?
Thank you very much. I want to be first, partly also to express once again my thanks for this really interesting conference. I've learned a huge amount, and I'm really grateful to you for all the effort you've put into it. I've got three very brief comments, and I just wonder, but I mean, I just advanced them as tentatively. I think the first thing that struck me, having heard everything, and this is not very satisfactory from the point of view of somebody who is a director for a Center for Geopolitics, but actually it seems to me that the great powers are perhaps less important than they think in this story, because so much of what we heard was actually local actors finding room for maneuver, and Lithuania obviously really vindicating its interest in a challenging environment. But it also seems, you know, listening to some of the other papers, I mean, Pyrah, for example, on Denmark, it would have suited certainly the victor powers for Denmark to have taken more, but as we heard, it didn't. So I think one thing that comes across is, you know, question mark, you know, how important are the great powers? Obviously they are at one level, but then when you drill down, it gets very, very nuanced. Secondly, one thing that seemed to me is that at this point, a little attempt to change the ethnographic picture by expulsion. Obviously in Memel, as far as I can make out, there weren't any expulsions. And And some of the other cases mentioned, I think neither, or at least not on a large scale. So that's very different, obviously, from what happens in Asia Minor and in Greece, big exchanges. And of course, so essentially the borders move, but the populations by and large don't, and that happens then in 1945. And then finally, just it seems to me that actually the experience in Memel prior to 1944 is quite mild. I mean, considering everything that's going on in the rest of Europe, really all the deaths are a tragedy, obviously, but it's a relatively small number of people who are killed or expelled. And so, in that sense, it's a more cheerful story than I would have expected. So these are my comments.
My comment would be also a tentative kind of suggestion to think about violence more. Well, I wrote about violence a lot, so I cannot get rid, thinking about violence and our conference today. And we spoke with Peter during the break to what extent there is a difference between, let's say, what happens in the German and Danish borderland and what happens in Upper Silesia or in the Polish-Lithuanian borderland. That is in the zones of post-violence. And my tentative question to everyone is, when we speak about these micro-regions, we look at Galicia, at Polish-Lithuanian borderland, at Carinthia, and others. Aren't they the zones where there was a massive scale of violence before the borders were settled? Is it some kind of factor that is really affecting what will happen later? Or it is not? And also, I was trying to think about Tarazara's idea of national indifference. And she didn't speak about violence a lot. But there were some people who started doing that, asking the question, to what extent violence can be an instrument of creating national identities? But not only forcing people to choose for security reasons who they are. In this situation, this identity can be a very shaky, very weak, it could be very situational or opportunistic, but also military conflicts, they always kind of force people to accept some kind of propagandist narratives very often. These propagandist narratives, they also create a sense of identity for people. So isn't it the case that these conflicts kind of they essentialize national identities? And they try to do that even in the regions where these identities were very tentative, very weak. So I'm not trying to overdo it, but let's think about it, is violence important here, or are we overemphasizing it? So that this is my kind of question and my insight.
Donatas would like to say something about importance of violence.
Thank you very much. Whatever I say can be used against me because I had the pleasure to be one of the organizers of the conference, and I should have probably said this before and not after the conference. But the thing that was, let's say, lacking or underrepresented was the official Polish policy on the Memel issue, because the Memel problem, the Memel question was huge in Polish policy ever since 1919. If you look at archives of Archiwum Acht Nowych, there is Memel. There are files. The Poles really wanted access through Memel to the Baltic Sea, and their interest there was tremendous. So perhaps this could be something for maybe another conference. Otherwise, really good stuff. I've learned a lot, and thank you very much.
I'm taking over. I just thought about the introduction by Vasilijus, and he mentioned a conference a few kilometers from here in Kirulai. 30 years ago, I think Ruth and I, we are the only, not survivors, but the only, but the only persons who took part in this conference, and I just started a little bit to compare the themes and so on. So 30 years ago, it was kind of sensational to talk about this. We didn't know anything about this whole thing. We had no German sources, we had no clear Lithuanian sources. We only had the narratives, uprising. Huh? And from the German side, we had break of human rights, of self-determination, and so on. So when I'm looking back now and compare this to our presentations and so on, we are now on a level with the sources. Yeah, in Vilnius, the German position, the French position, yeah, the English, the Poles, yeah, everything is now clear. We put in the last 30 years, we put this puzzle together. And we are now on a totally new step with microregions. Now we compare Klaipėda with other regions. And I remember for 30 years ago, it was still a kind of political provocation if you are in Lithuania did not talk about uprising. And in Germany also, and now the title is Annexation. Yeah? So it's a kind of... okay, yeah. So what I'd like to see, this is a classical example of academic progress. Yeah, no, it's new. We had no themes. We see the region in a totally different perspectives.
Okay, the survivals have seen some progress.
Thank you. One thing that really struck me during the conference, and that's something that Brendan also mentioned from a different perspective, is that, and that had never occurred to me before, that I think this conference has shown why the Klaipėda region is a really good case for why we need to look at the history of Europe, or maybe even the history of the world, through the lens of these peripheral regions. And I think what really struck me is that what happened was that Lithuania took a region that had formerly belonged to a great power, Germany, that was then administered by another great power, France, and they just took it and nothing happened. And imagine that before the First World War, the Congress of Vienna, European system, rested on the idea that small states, if they interfered in the stability of Europe, they would be severely punished. In the Cold War, if something like that had happened, it probably wouldn't have happened because the superpowers would have feared that it would turn into a global conflict or something like that. So it says so much about the interwar period and the instability or the lack of an enforceable international order that you can probably recognize much more if you look at it from the perspective of from Klaipėda than if you look at Berlin, London, France, so Paris. So I found that really, really striking.
I also just want to throw two considerations into the discussion. The one is the problematic aspect of looking at linguistic maps and thinking this is our guidepost for redrawing borders. We can see that consistently around the end of World War I, that this does not really work, and it creates pretty much new problems very often, and if you have plebiscites, they often do not reflect the linguistic borders as closely as we might have expected. In this connection then, I also feel that one thing that I missed a little about our conference were the Memelites. Actually, those Memelites that in 1925 show up in the census and call themselves Memelites, which I'm fairly sure consist predominantly of Little Lithuanians. So Protestant Lithuanian speakers who still identify, if push comes to shove, more with Prussia than with Lithuania. But in general, they're not unique. I mean, we have the Masurians, we have to a certain extent many Upper Silesians, we have the so-called German-friendly Slovenes in Carinthia, which are important for the outcome of the result there. So we might want to investigate more about the way of thinking of Memelites, of the Memel population, beyond just German and Lithuanian. The other consideration that I have is that I think what in many ways, and I tried to say that a little in my presentation too, set the Schleswig or Danish position apart and shows what was lacking in so many situations was the political forethought. The thinking about, okay, my decisions now, what will they mean in 10, 20, 30 years? And in general, we have to say, and the instability of East Central Europe that is mentioned in the interwar era is largely based on the fact that the two major powers were all in crisis at that time, both Germany and Russia. So all kinds of geopolitical decisions were being taken with two huge players out of the game. But anybody could have foreseen that they were not going to stay out of the game forever, and they didn't. And so that's why so many of these decisions then did not stand. And we have to say also the Memel decision did not stand. Implicitly then, it helped to be reinstituted in 1945, but the Memel question was resettled again in 1939, and if Germany hadn't lost another war, Lithuania would still not have Klaipėda. So in that sense, you cannot say that in 1923, Lithuania really did the smart thing, as we can see, because now Memel has been Lithuanian for 100 years. That would really take out a very important piece. And that's what distinguishes it from the Schleswig question, because that border did always stand. It also stood during the German occupation of Denmark during World War II. So it had a completely different legitimacy because the Danish government, to a large extent, had thought into the future. What does it mean if we take all we can get right now in 10 years, in 20 years, because Germany is not always going to be as weak as it is right now. So those would just be the two thoughts I would throw into the game.
Some comments about your thoughts. You always loses world wars, so that comment. The second comment was about Memelanders. So actually, term which appears in the census, if we look at the details, we see that some Jews, local Jews, also are Memelanders, then German speakers, and then Lithuanian speakers. So it's not about the Prussian Lithuanians. It's kind of more a term which involves more local population here in 1925. Do you have something to say, Jerzy?
Not at this point.
Okay.
Thanks. So this is really building on some comments that were already made, but in some of the earlier discussion, I was thinking of a term that was central to Klaus's presentation on empowerment, and I think across a lot of presentations. I mean, I was thinking about the complexity and diversity of the kinds of empowerment that you see both at the level of nation states. I think breaking that down a little bit and picking up on Klaus's argument in terms of central state bureaucracies and sort of outsiders to these micro-regions as being empowered in certain ways. But picking up on something that Peter was just saying, I think these processes do, in a kind of backhanded and counterintuitive way, empower the local microregions themselves and their residents. It's certainly evident in Upper Silesia, where you see people moving back and forth between a language of abjection, of being sort of taken over by outside powers, that on the one hand, but also a language of empowerment, of feeling like they're the beneficiaries of a bidding war. And I think in a lot of these other regions, this feeds into the kind of longevity of these local identities, even after processes that were supposed to eliminate them. And just a final thought in terms of varieties of empowerment, I think particularly of Ruth's discussion of Jewish entrepreneurs, but just at the level of all sorts of individuals with their own personal and family and economic strategies of how they were able to navigate these situations, and again, in very unique ways, were and to various degrees also empowered through these processes. So that was just an additional thought.
Someone else? Thomas wants to add.
You know, I thought that one aspect was missing from our conference, and that is the issue of minorities. The concept emerges basically after the Versailles Treaty, and the question is to what extent the emergence of minorities and their rights affect, you know, these microregions. Wasn't it the case that gaining the status of officially protected minority was an encouragement for those people who did not have clearly defined identities to gain one? Interestingly, the Paris system is not defending any rights of people like Tuteishi, Memelanders, and so on, because it's difficult to define them in ethnic and national terms. So I'm just adding this because I think, you know, it's important. In some situations, I repeat already myself that gaining the status of minority was beneficial for some from these people, and it could have been the instrument of gaining a new identity. Since no one, I think, spoke about that, so that I felt we should mention that.
I've found this fascinating. I'm sorry I've only been here for a day, but really congratulations to you for what you've achieved here. I think it's excellent. My comment follows on the last one. A theme that's been striking me all day is thinking about Ireland and Northern Ireland. And of course, Brendan knows about this history much better than I do. But commenting on your point earlier about violence, one of the most powerful documents in terms of getting to a resolution which finally concluded with the Good Friday Agreement was a document about the cost in lives of the Northern Ireland conflict, which was produced by John Hume and the Social Democratic and Labour Party about 30 years ago. And it really made home. If we continue like this, we just continue losing hundreds of lives every year in an unacceptable way. Therefore, there is an obligation to find a solution. And one of the forces in Northern Ireland were called the Peace Women, who made a massive argument about the need for peace just of itself to escape the violence which had been so deeply destructive. But looking into the more long-term area, I've been interested for some while in the concept of national cultural autonomy, which many of you will know here about here more than I do. But it's directly on Thomas's points about minorities, and it raises the question in very direct terms: how do you govern these places where one quotes country unquotes or quotes nation unquotes is ruling it? Well, what happens to all the people who live inside that country who may be have different values? How do you deal with language? How do you deal with the education system? How do you deal with a legal system that gains the confidence of people? Police who gain the confidence of people throughout? Those are enormous questions. And this idea of national cultural autonomy, which, as you know, really started about 1918, 1919, and was an idea where you could have independence of your own schools, your own language, of particular minorities inside other governance, which was of a majority kind, was quite important in a large number of areas. And it's actually been quite important, I think, now, post-1991, in relation to some Soviet areas. And you talked about frozen conflicts earlier. And that's a core question. I don't know if you noticed 3 or 4 days ago, the president of Armenia said in relation to Nagorno-Karabakh that he was ready to see a solution with the government of Azerbaijan on the basis of the national interests of Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh being properly protected. Well, what is the basis of that guarantee? How does it operate as you move from a violence, what was called a frozen conflict, to a more live situation? Well, what are those guarantees? How are they taken forward? I think it's not a criticism of the conference, because obviously this conference wasn't about that, but the interesting question of how was Memel governed for all the people living in Memel over the period that we've been talking about is an interesting dimension of that too, and has a lot of very wide applications in different areas. As we look around the world today, of course, there's a whole string of so-called frozen conflicts, many of them involving the Soviet Union historically, where the question arises, well, how do we move forward? The institute in Flensburg, I can't remember its name, it's called something like the European Institute of National Minorities or something of that, yeah, has done a lot of tremendous work on this kind of thing. And I think it's a very interesting dimension of all of this, which is not simply in whose name is the government of the country run, though that's a very important question, but it's how is the country governed in the interest of all the people who are within it. And I think that's a difficult and problem, and in my opinion, there's inadequate thinking about this, and it remains a serious blockage as one tries to move forward to different political solutions to solving these difficulties where they continue to exist.
Robert finally wants to say something.
Thank you. Well, it's hard to follow that comment, but this is really just a tiny footnote. It's really about the question of prestige, which I feel has been, few of us have been dancing around, and particularly is relevant to what I'm doing, of course, which changes radically over time. What is the prestigious identity, particularly playing into the idea of situational identity? Prestige seems to be an under-discussed factor. What is the prestigious identity? Not just because it has, in the moment, a situational advantage and economic advantage, but also a kind of cultural prestige attached to it. It seems that the imperial narrative does come back. The empire strikes back. Germany is suddenly talked about here. Again, economic advantage, but I'm just wondering, is prestige also a factor? Is there a kind of reference? Now that it's at a safe distance from ever functionally becoming German again, it's definitively Lithuanian, it's now possible to reactivate that discourse of prestige. Same with the Habsburg narrative in Lviv today, similar perhaps with other regions, Trieste, and also the Habsburg narrative that you mentioned, Andreas. You know, suddenly it's come back, whereas previously it was entirely rejected. So it's a tiny footnote, but I'm aware that it's come back when we talk about legacies. Also, in terms of flipping the perspective from these sort of colonial discourses to decolonialized discourses. Obviously, that's a big subject in Ukraine today for very obvious reasons. Decolonizing Ukraine also in terms of the hot war on the ground, but also the narrative, the kind of integration of the country into an all-Russian, all-dominant imperial historiography, kind of flipping the perspective. So I think there the dynamics are very different. It'll be a very long time before there's any attachment to a kind of Russian narrative at macro state level. But otherwise, it just strikes me as a potential tiny footnote, a tiny little layer on top that we might look at when considering how these discourses evolve longue durée and then come back in the present. In other words, the imperial intertext.
I see no hands. Yes, later, okay? Oh. That was not? Okay, thank you very much for coming to Klaipėda and to Vilnius to this conference. I think we haven't got all the answers, but we raised many questions, and this is when the science begins, so to say, when we raise the questions. So, so thank you for raising them in this final discussion as well. And yeah, some details at the end of the conference. So first, the bus will wait you to guide to Vilnius. So 4 hours in the bus, please be ready for that. You are staying in the same hotel in Vilnius for one night, and the details on the reimbursement of your travel expenses will follow. So I have already sent you the details some months ago, but I will repeat them just to make sure that you are getting relevant information, so to say. So thank you once again. I think it was a pleasure to have you all here, and see you next time.
I just would like to thank Vasilijus in person, you know, for the idea of this conference, for the organizational work that he did, because he was the major driving engine, you know, behind it. I was trying to help, Donatas was trying to help, other people tried to help, you know, but without him, probably this thing would never have happened. So thank you very much for what you did.